Number 10. Hold the mustard, please. World War I cannot be talked about without talking about the crazy advancements in technology. Seemingly, nations and empires were just itching to try them out on each other. Airplanes, tanks, blimps, machine guns, mostly fairly new and extremely lethal. However, the life of a World War I soldier cannot be talked about without talking about mustard gas or chemical weapons. In 1907, major world players agreed to ban chemical weapons from warfare. So you can understand the confusion by Allied soldiers on the Second Battle of Ypres when over 150 tons of chlorine gas were released. A terrible weapon that would cause trouble breathing, burns, and vomiting. It was so effective that the Allies immediately began working on their own chemical weapons and gas masks to prevent the effects of this supervillain level weapon. I think this quote by World War II General MacArthur sums it up. Whoever said the pen is mightier than the sword obviously never encountered automatic weapons. He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Number 9. All quiet on the Western Front. This is kind of obvious, but people die in war. In World War I, a lot of people died, and a lot of these young men and comrades in arms formed bonds with one another, only to have those friends and brothers be killed and taken away from each other. Over 2 million German soldiers would perish in the First World War, which later would have all kinds of disastrous effects on the country, especially with the rise of Evil Mustache Man. France also lost a similar amount of men. Trench warfare was brutal, and I'll get to that shortly. One of my favorite books and movies, actually, All Quiet on the Western Front, depicts a group of young German boys who are in this thing together, all while having a strong anti-war message, or at least questioning the legitimacy of the First World War. Just make sure when you're in the trenches, no one's handing you those fresh new boots. It's an omen. Number 8. 1-star review. It may come as a surprise to some of you, but living in the trenches on the Western Front wasn't a super fun time. We don't recommend it here at BumbleBee. If you're like me, then you love a good hearty meal. Like my mom always said, I'm a meat and potato kind of guy. That's just how it goes. A nice grilled rare steak, roasted garlic potatoes, and a freshly tossed crisp lettuce Caesar salad. Ooh, that sounds amazing. I'm kind of hungry now. And maybe a beer or two to wash it down. Just a classic meal for a classic guy that I really enjoy. Sadly for the boys in the trenches, this could not have been further from reality. Anyone in the military today with our modern technology will tell you how delicious MRE rations are. But for soldiers of the First World War, rations were limited. And as time went on, especially on the German side, where in 1918 rations were whittled down to turnip soup and turnip bread. Ugh. There were still beer rations. However, and if I'm going to be shot at, I still want a little ale to cure what ails me. You know what I'm saying? Go a long way. Number 7. Trench living. I know after a long day of work, most folks like to kick back and relax. A nice warm house, a cold beer, maybe the game's on. You come home to a family that loves you. The life of a soldier in World War I was more of the horrific variety. Basically, you live in a deep hole that stretches for miles and interconnects with tunnels and other trenches. It's freezing cold in the winter, blistering hot in the summer. Rain's right on top of you, and the mud. Oh, the mud is an issue. Bogged down in a muddy hole, wet freezing with other miserable men who are also wet and freezing. Just not a fun time for anyone involved. I love winter and a good rainstorm here and there, but the difference is I get to come out of the cold after a long day making snow angels or jumping in puddles. The impending doom and being soaking wet would damper anyone's mood. Number 5. Stranger danger. We all know if there's a van that rolls up to your neighborhood and there's a man inside offering free candy, it's gonna be a bad time. Well, North Korea might have had the biggest and baddest van in the neighborhood, as it's estimated that 84,000 people were kidnapped during the war. That is so many people. Why was North Korea putting so many faces on the side of milk cartons, you ask? Well, it was mainly a forced repopulation tactic, which again is so messed up I can't even begin to tell you how wrong that is, but also may have been the beginning of a super secret spy program, where North Korea was interested in having biracial spies, making it easier to infiltrate the enemy. Just one of many nefarious activities North Korea has been up to. There is no spy program in North Korea, and I am not saying, I am absolutely saying this of my own free will. Please do not send help. Number 4. Not actually a war. While there were a lot of bang bang shooty shooty killy killy during the Korean War, technically it wasn't really a war, even though it feels like one. Being referred to as a police matter. Yeah, the US sent a lot of troops to fight this not war, which in case you're wondering how that's possible, you can take a look at Congress, as Congress never declared war. setting a new precedent. Although, after the millions of dollars spent, the loss of thousands of soldiers on each side, plus the UN force being comprised of 16 other nations. I'm not exactly sure how it's not a war. That's like me saying, I did not do my English essay because it's not an English essay. It's a 2-page opinionated piece that should be 4 pages, but I didn't read the book and just used Cliff Notes. Sorry, Mrs. M. I mean, come on, can you blame me? Have you ever actually tried to sit down and read Lord of the Flies? Not in a school setting? I called the chief last night. You know what? He said it wasn't it. Number 3, Top Gun. Ask any military history guru or anyone who's got a thing for it and they will tell you that after World War II, military tech was about to get a little crazy. On September 8th, 1950, something a little spicy happened in regards to both military and aviation history. The world's first all-jet dogfight took place. Americans in F-80s and communists piloting the infamous MiG. Despite a movie that I actually think isn't very good, this wasn't great for the Americans. Yes, they did end up shooting down the enemy, but it was clear that the MiG was outperforming the F-80. Forced American aviation to come up with something just a little bit better. Come on guys, you can do it. Number 2, just in case. So it's been years since the Korean War. They've been split in half. DMZ is there. Everything's kosher, right? Well, not exactly. If you followed the news in recent years, you know that North Korea has been doing some unsavory testing with ballistic missiles. However, what some people may not know, and it's kind of messed up when you think about it, is to this day there is still a large number of US soldiers stationed in South Korea. 30,000 to be exact. A remnant from the Korean War, but something that many would consider to be a necessity given the hostile nature of the North Korean regime. Hopefully things stay in a stalemate and don't escalate. We got enough problems on our hands right now. On a side note, there's also a large concentration of US soldiers in Japan as well. Not directly related to the Korean War, but they are in close proximity just in case anything sneaky happens. Okay. Number 1, big boom, little changes. World War I changed lives. It dissolved century-old empires, completely redrew the map. World War II doesn't happen without World War I, and it was so bad, the whole world swore to never let that happen again. Heck, even wars from centuries ago had more cause and effect. The Korean War is very different in this regard. Like previously mentioned, the communists were bad, but the capitalists were not much better. While the lines may not be as blurred as some wars, the outcome was completely different to what most people were used to. When World War II ended, there was cheering in the streets. When the Korean War ended, there just wasn't much to show for it, besides a tragic loss of life, debt, and a new theory about communism that would literally make the exact same thing happen in Vietnam 15 years later. Seriously, the comparisons are uncanny. It's like the exact same thing. Crazy. Number 10, third-party involvement. You'd be forgiven if you thought the Vietnam War was a really bad war between the United States and Vietnam. Literally every book, movie, or depiction of the late 60s conflict is GIs in green walking through the jungle brush as Huey helicopters buzz over the tree canopies. Chaos surrounding as a Rolling Stones or other influential song from the era plays in the background. The camera pans out to show how thick the jungle is, as the soldiers are always looking for someone named Charlie. Wonder if they found him. Forrest Gump jokes aside, good movie, go see it. Yes, that is the Vietnam War for the US, but there were actually a few other countries involved. More than you might think. The Soviet Union and China were 100% supporting Vietnamese communists. The French years prior were trying to claim back an old colony, and Australia also sent soldiers to support the effort. And perhaps most strangely, South Korea sent soldiers to aid South Vietnam, so the same thing didn't happen to them. That's just a crazy mix, isn't it? Number 9. Are you done? If you ever find yourself getting captured by spooky, scary communists, maybe you should remember Doug Hegel, a sailor who was blown overboard by a ship gun and washed ashore to probably the worst shore to wash up on in the 1960s. Maybe that or a nude beach full of hippies, I digress. Doug eventually found himself in a super friendly POW camp. Doug knew he was going to be in some trouble, and if he didn't think fast, was going to be subjected to torment that isn't appropriate for any YouTube or TV show on air. So, what did Doug do? A daring escape, you say? Eliminated all his enemies from the stealth that only a cardboard box could provide? Hang upside down with tri-light night vision goggles and wait for guards to walk by? No, my stealth gaming friends. He played dumb. Very dumb. In order to convince the enemy that he wasn't worth very much, so that in theory they would let him go. Not convinced, the Viet Cong tried to get Doug to spew propaganda. Doug made a 5-head play and pretended he couldn't read. He pretended to be 3-head. After many efforts, the Viet Cong declared him the incredibly stupid one. He was eventually released back to the US, where he gave some intel on the Viet Cong that he remembered over his time locked up, which he remembered to the tune of Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Doesn't get any more American than that. Old MacDonald had a farm. Yeah, okay, anyway. Number 8, 360 all scope. Remember the days of Modern Warfare 2? Remember hitting those early spawn shots on high rise with the intervention? Yes, me too. Times have changed, and although the days of waking up early on Saturday morning to rip a little Call of Duty while your parents fight in the next room may be gone for me, they are not forgotten. I wasn't the best sniper out there, but I could hit a shot or two. However, no energy drink fueled YY ladder stall compares to the White Feather. Meet Carlos Hathcock, a sharpshooter from the Vietnam War whose accuracy would have Robin Hood questioning his bowstrings. He is credited with taking down a lot of enemies from quite a staggering distance away. However, his biggest claim to fame would be his Robin Hood splitting arrow moment. One day in the Vietnam jungle, he spotted an enemy sniper and terminated the threat. The thing is that Hathcock's bullet went through the enemy's scope and ended his sniping career. That's one heck of a shot. Mom, get the camera! Number 7, tall courage. Richard Flaherty was unusual to most US soldiers deployed in Vietnam at the time. He was a short king, measuring in just short of 5 feet, which was the US requirement for soldiers at the time. His training proved that while he was short, he was just as effective as the other soldiers. Nicknamed the Mighty Mouse and the Giant Killer when in the field, his courage and efforts would see him join the famous 101st Airborne, where he was sent on search and destroy missions in the thick jungle brush. His efforts would eventually earn him a Silver Star, and would wind up in the very tough yet mysterious Green Berets. Never judge a book by its cover. Number 6. Yeah, of course I am the American. Larry Thorne was a soldier and a great leader for US forces training civilians in Vietnam. Distinguished with medals and wasn't afraid to get dirty. He helped defend a base from a Vietnamese attack, and if he wasn't there, it most likely would have gone FUBAR. However, that's not what's so messed up about Mr. Thorne. Larry was hiding something rather interesting. Being a little bit older, it made sense that he had been in the military for a while. However, it wasn't the US Army. Larry had fought in 2 other armies previously. The Finland Army, which was his home against the Soviets in the Winter War, and more disturbingly, fought with the German Waffen SS. Yeah, I am an American and I have no prior actions that would cause you to have any suspicion. Yeah. Sadly for the man with all that experience, he perished in a helicopter crash in 1965. His body was recovered years later and was given full military honors when buried. You never know who you're standing beside.
Number 5. Battle of Two Sisters. The third battle that took place on the night of June 11th was the Battle of Two Sisters. This battle, as well as Mount Harriet and Mount Longdon, were brigade-sized operations that all happened, remind you, on the same night. The British were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, and the support consisted of Royal Marines of 45 Commando, the anti-tank troop from 40 Commando, with support from 29 Commando Regiment and naval support from the HMM Glamran. Originally, 45 Commando was to seize Two Sisters Mountain overnight, hiding in the darkness, and if there was enough time, use said darkness to advance onto Tumbledown Mountain. Argentine forces were ready, so the second phase of the attack was unable to happen as they wanted to. In total, 22 British soldiers lost their lives, a destroyer was hit, as well as 3 helicopters, 22 were killed with 47 wounded. Number 4. Friendly fire. On the 6th of June, 1982, an incident occurred which claimed the lives of 4 British soldiers. Navy destroyer HMS Cardiff destroyed the friendly Gazelle helicopter. So what happened? How does something like this happen in the first place? Well, the HMS Cardiff was on lookout for Argentinian forces. Supplies coming into the Falklands Islands, of course, is a no-go. So on the night of June 5th, HMS Cardiff was stationed east of the islands, and at 2 a.m. they detected the British Gazelle helicopter, thinking that it was an attack. The helicopter was actually making a routine delivery with both equipment and soldiers on board. So what went wrong here? Well, first, after the Sea Dart missile was fired, the next morning it was assumed enemy fire was initially responsible. The Ministry of Defense stated they didn't want to cause further anguish to relatives while they were trying to piece together what went wrong, so it was a lot happening in one night. So some articles made it sound like they tried to hide it. It was really just they had their hands full and it was an accident. A lack of communication between the Army and the Navy was to blame, but not one individual per se, confirms the Board of Inquiry. The 5th Infantry Brigade had not notified anybody of the helicopter's flight, so it was a surprise to many, especially coming in at that speed to that location. The radar also doesn't look good at 2 a.m. when you see that blip coming in. And on top of that, the helicopter's identification friend or foe transmitter, the IFF, it was turned off at this point because it had previously interfered with the Army's anti-aircraft system. So it was just an accident. Number 3. HMS Sheffield. The Type 42 guided missile destroyer was the second Royal Navy ship to be named after the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. In response to the Argentine invasion, Sheffield was sent to retake the islands on April 2nd, 1982. Captain Salt had ordered the ship to change course every 90 seconds to avoid submarine threat. The 2 weeks prior to the attack, Argentine forces were training against their own ships, which happened to include Type 42 destroyers, the same class as the HMS Sheffield. So they knew the radar detection distances and their reaction times like the back of their hand at this point. They used a technique called pecking the lobes, which meant that they would avoid detection by flying on the side of the emitting radar, out of sight. The destroyer was hit on May 4th and foundered while under tow 6 days later on May 10th. Number 2. The Battle of Seal Cove. Just west of Lively Island during the Falklands War, the Battle of Seal Cove was also underway. On May 22, the British frigates HMS Brilliant and HMS Yarmouth were supporting Operation Sutton. This was happening right off of San Carlos Bay when they received orders to stop and take over an Argentinian coastal supply boat, the ARA Monsunan. It was a 326-ton British coaster that had previously been owned by the Falkland Islands Company, but during the invasions, the ship was captured. It was also loaded with 150 drums of fuel and 250 sacks of flour. The HMS Yarmouth opened fire and forced that vessel to beach on Seal Cove. And finally, coming in at number 1, young soldiers. It's important to remember how young these brave soldiers were at the time. I wanted to finish this list off by sharing the words of a Royal Navy veteran who was only a teenager during the Falklands War. Craig Mac McDermott was 17 at the time. Craig was on the HMS Antrim in 1982 when conflict took off. The actual location of the Falkland Islands is different than most expect. Craig explains his initial thoughts at the time. He shared this in the Daily Record last November. When I first heard of the Falkland Islands, like many people, I thought they were just off the north of Scotland. I didn't know where they were, but there's no way I will ever forget them after everything I've witnessed. We were naive and too young to understand the severity of what we were about to encounter. The air attacks were constant and there were several injured during each of the attacks. The suffering was indescribable and something that I'll never be able to forget. Thank you for your service, Craig.
Number 10. The Cold War. Some of our viewers may have lived through the times classified as the Cold War, but let me clarify for anyone who doesn't know or was too deep into hippie culture to remember what the heck was going on. And honestly, it's pretty messed up. So in a nutshell, after World War II ended, Germany was split into two. One side, capitalist allies, the other, communist Soviet Union. Russia was an ally during World War II, but this relationship quickly deteriorated. The two political and economic ideologies would grow distaste for one another and would compete politically, economically, and most fearfully with their militaries. The United States being the superpower on the one side and the Soviet Union on the other. They spread their views, a lot of times by force, until almost the entire world was divided by the two styles of government, lasting from 1945 all the way up until MTV was still good, around the mid-90s. When the Soviet Union was dissolved. That's a lot of history to unpack here, so I'm gonna do my best to tell you some crazy facts and to make you laugh. I'm a comedian, it's what I do. Number 9. Charlie in the trees. We've talked about Vietnam a few times on this channel, but I can't stress this enough. It was messed up for many people, Americans and Vietnamese alike. As a Canadian, we mostly dodged that hairy situation. While the Vietnam War was America's worst war since World War II, and the most costly in terms of lives and budget, it was not the only conflict. Vietnam was probably the hottest war of the Cold War, but there's many other little things that make this such an interesting time. France had spent years trying to reclaim their colony, and with no luck. America being there for a total legit reason of containment also didn't have much luck, especially after 1968. Refer to our Vietnamese war videos, they're pretty good. Lives lost, lessons learned, and hopefully somebody found Charlie. I swear in every movie they're always looking for a guy named Charlie. I guess we never find him, I don't know. Number 8. The name's Bond. James Bond. It would be difficult to talk about the Cold War without talking about espionage and spies. While not to the exaggerated level the 007 series likes to take things with its, well, little people and lethal hat throwing, there was still, however, a ton of black ops going on behind the scenes. You only have to look at the superpower spy agencies, the CIA and the KGB. Both agencies went on globe-trotting clandestine operations to gather information, sabotage, and just about anything else James Bond would do. Stealth, spy gadgets, and missions to save the world. All martini shaken, of course, not stirred. Just like Bond, except the whole womanizing thing. Or maybe there was, as the Soviets would often use women's alluring good looks to produce results they so wished for. Ah yes, thanks to beautiful female agents sleeping a lot, thank you, we now know we are one step closer to discovering the Colonel's secret herbs and spices. Our chicken shall have flavor soon. Number 7, Fallout. Probably the heaviest underlying theme of the Cold War was the constant and looming threat of nuclear annihilation. The US got smart in the end of 1945 and developed and used the world's first atomic bombs. This was great for America, not so great for Japan. America was feeling mighty high. That was until the Soviet Union developed their own shortly after. Now it wasn't so cool anymore. Both sides were worried that further escalation of any issue in the Cold War would lead to mutually assured destruction, rendering the bombs the most destructive weapon on Earth and also the most useless. And to be fair, there was a good chance of that happening. There were multiple instances of escalation where the world watched on as the two superpowers were about to end it all. Finna act up because they wanted their politics to be number one. I'ma act up. Number 6, Space Race. No, the space race is not a race on how many special brownies that you can eat and see how fast it takes you to space out. Remember grade 10, right? I know. What it actually was a race to see who could develop the best and fastest space age technology and advancements. Which, if you study economics, could be a good thing. Healthy competition driven by new technology. In reality, it kinda sucked though. In the 1950s, Russia launched the first satellite, the Sputnik. Which to America was scary because it's America. We never lost anything. The Soviet Union would follow up with the first animal in space and then the first man. Some experiments unfortunately never made it back in one piece. America then trumped them back by landing on the moon. Now what's so messed up? Well, for the Soviet Union, this began to put a severe dent in their economy. All the spending on space and military was having an effect on their people. In a nutshell, it made them broke. And if you want to figure out what style of government is better, well, the US has Las Vegas, Russia has beets, and turnips, and depressed artists. Number 5, the Bataan March. The Bataan March is very similar to the beep test. Or imagine track and field in school, except instead of teachers forcing you to compete in events not designed around your body type, thanks, you're a soldier and the Imperial Japanese Army is making you march miles in the brutal sun. And some people with no shoes on, who often get berated and tormented. Okay, I guess the two aren't very similar at all, but you get the point. All you need to know is that some POWs took a very long walk, and a lot of these POWs, for sure, were not supposed to be treated that way. It was really bad actually. Did not make it to the destination at all. MacArthur said he was coming back after this, and boy did he. Ooh, he came back with a vengeance. Number 4, veterans. This one is a broad stroke, but I think it fits the bill here. Pretty accurately, actually. This goes out to all veterans of the Second World War. Folks at home, you might have to show them this because I can imagine they're a little bit older and probably not too familiar with YouTube, but thank you to all the men and women out there who did their part and paid a bill that I know I never could. The closest I ever want to be to a battlefield is, well, Battlefield, or Call of Duty. From the campaigns in Africa, Italy, France, and pushing all the way into Germany, as well as the brave fighting in the Pacific. I remember, and I for one am very thankful. You don't need to tell me how hard it was to survive or the fight when you came back home. A little wholesome point there. I love that. You guys are great. Thank you very much. Number 3, Bob Hoover, the pilot's pilot. You gotta respect the style of Bob Hoover. Okay, so let's say you spend a year in a German POW camp. You make for your escape, except now what? If it's early 1940s like Bob Hoover found himself in, not a lot of Germanless areas to be in. Well, Bob Hoover knew he needed to say Auf Wiedersehen and get the heck out of there. Bob Hoover did not walk, however. No. He did something much, cooler. Kind of like when you hijack your first Banshee in Halo 3. Yeah, same thing, and same feeling. Bob, being the excellent pilot he was, managed to steal a German plane and flew back to safety, where he linked up with some British allies in the area. How James Bond of you, sir. Oh yes, I love it. Number 2, Ivan Chizov. Another airplane story, but gosh darn, this one is really impressive. Ivan Chizov was a Russian fighter pilot who was having some plane troubles. And by plane troubles, I mean it was going to crash. So yeah, not good. The man knew he had to eject, but the troublesome German planes around him, and the German planes being known for shooting at parachuters, well, he knew he had to make a 5-head play. He said, I'll just wait till I'm below the ensuing air battle and then I'll pull my parachute. Well, sadly, he waited too long and his chute didn't open. He fell 5,000 meters to the ground and lived. He lived. Poor Ivan did sustain some serious injuries, but like a miracle got the medical attention he needed and asked to join back in the fight only 3 months later. That's just kind of crazy. 5,000 meters and he lived? How? Number 1, German summer camp. I promise it's not going where you think it's going. The international community had an idea of what Germany was up to during the years before World War II, but no one really knew for sure. When Allies moved into occupied Europe, it was clear some people were gonna have some explaining to do, okay? You can't do this, guy. You can't do that, man. You can't do that. But you guys knew that. It was awful and it should never happen again. You guys know what I'm talking about. However, today the worst camp I want to talk about is their youth program. Mustache Man was trying to build a better Germany. If you started with the youngins, the camp was designed like many today to give young folks something to do, to educate them, keep them occupied, or in my mom's case, some peace and quiet during the summer. Well, at this camp it wasn't bonfires and swimming, it was all kinds of nasty things YouTube probably won't let me say. But what I can tell you is that it was a brainwashing effort to get everyone in support of their not so glorious leader. Number 10, no half measures. In a time of great socialist revolution and trying to defeat the white royalist army, the socialist red army knew that they'd have to full send or no send. And what I mean by that is eliminate the royal family, so that the royalist army has no one to fight for or reinstall should the red army fail. Yeah, sadly this is true. Nicholas II and his wife and his children were terminated on July 17th, 1918. The whole family gone in a shooting that almost resembles a certain Al Capone related incident. Was this really necessary? I don't know. Would the Royalist Army have really tried to reinstall Nicky or someone else since they were backed by other foreign powers? Regardless, this still happened and the Red Army was victorious, ushering in the birth of the USSR and the start of communism. Also, arguably the start of the Cold War, but that's debatable. Number 9, the cost of revolution. War is war, and that means a tragic loss of life. The Russian Civil War is no different in that statement. That being said, the Russian Civil War is the most costly civil war in history. It's a Guinness record, so you know it's official. An estimated 1.5 million combatants would perish in the battle between white and red. Worse than that, an estimated 8 million civilians lost their lives. It was a brutal civil war, especially for the civilian population, as food was short and disease was high. I am sure after the war was over, the communists were super nice to the people and in no way restricted freedoms or persecuted certain groups with large prison-like work camps where people were disposed of and worked until they could not work anymore. I'm sure that didn't happen at all, right guys? Right? It happened. It actually did happen. It's pretty bad. Number 8, secure the keys. Oh, what? You mean the communists did not treat their people very well and ran a very brutal and powerful regime the second they had secured victory? Oh man, I never would have seen that coming. Yes, unfortunately for the people of the USSR, things were not so great. A fine example of things not being so great was the gulags. No, not the ones in war zone, real gulags. Labor camps where anyone the government felt was a threat to communism, criminals, POWs, and well, just about anyone they wanted to do away with were put in a gulag. But hold your comment typing fingers, my Call of Duty audience, because one of the worst gulags was Vorkuta. Yes, that's right. From Black Ops 1, Vorkuta was a labor camp that focused on mining and logging, and the prisoners were quite literally worked or starved to death, working labor-intensive jobs on a diet fit for a rat, speaking of which, rats and cats and dogs were often resorted to just to have a belly full of grub. This was just how the USSR dealt with things after the war. Step 8, Reznov! Freedom! For you, Mason! Not for me! Number 7, bread, peace, and death. Vladimir Lenin was the father of communism in Russia. It's why you see statues of the bald-headed hero everywhere, and that goatee he has, so pointy and sharp. He could poke a hole in any stinky bourgeoisie capitalist ideas. Unfortunately for the hunky communist hero, his time to enjoy the socialist utopia he and his cadres dreamed of would literally be short-lived. After gaining enough power to throw elections, the Soviets lost. But they decided elections might be a stinky imperialist idea anyway, so that was scrapped, and the Soviets took power. Oh, and Civil War time, that's right, that's what we're talking about. Just as Lenin was about to sit down and start doing government stuff, the Civil War broke out. The poor guy could use a break, and he got one in a series of strokes that seriously disabled the evil doppelganger of Uncle Pennybags. That's the Monopoly Man, in case you didn't understand that reference. He shortly would pass due to his failing health, and with his last words told the people to not let Stalin be in charge. Stalin then became in charge. Number 6. No one is safe. Trotsky, one of the founding fathers of Soviet Russia, surprisingly good military leader and an excellent organizer for the party. Besides his wacky haircut, it's just kinda weird, the man was well respected and played a crucial role in Russia's revolution and civil war. That means he was loved forever and lived a long life in his socialist utopia. Well, sadly for poor Trotsky, he became a victim of Stalinization. History's second favorite mustache man was ruthless to say the least, and after some political disagreements and organizing, Trotsky was banished from the Soviet Union, moving a couple times throughout Soviet-influenced Europe, where he would eventually end up in Mexico City. That's not in Europe, there's supposed to be a comma there. Maybe leaving the Soviet Union was a good thing. Maybe some fun in the hot Mexican sun would be great. Hey, what's that guy in the black suit doing? And why does he have an ice pick? Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin in 1940. Even someone as powerful as Trotsky was not safe from the wrath of the USSR. Imagine killing the guy that starts your country. That's why we shoot George Washington. That's crazy. Number 5. Helicopter War. Probably the most iconic iconography of the war is the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, or better known as the Huey. The Vietnam War was the first war to see extensive use of helicopters, and honestly, I'm not sure how Americans would have fought the war without them. One of the main reasons the Viet Cong were successful was because they knew the land, they knew the jungle, and used many tactics to their advantage. Oftentimes the jungle being their best weapon of defense itself. Even though chemicals and napalm were being used to help unjungle the jungle, it's the extensive use and effectiveness of the Huey helicopter that gave America the technological edge it so needed. For anyone that was actually there, I can just imagine the relief of soldiers that they must have felt when seeing those green beauties come barreling out of the sky. The helicopters turned out to be a great design and was used for many years after the Vietnam War. Number 4. Draft dodging. Grade 12, what a great time to be alive. You're about to graduate. All your friends are excited about spending one last summer together before everyone goes off to college. Maybe you'll spend some time down at the beach, go hang out at the mall, or maybe you'll find a summer fling at a summer party. Nice. And just as you were about to put those bell-bottom jeans on, your mom says you got a letter. Oh no. You just got drafted into the Vietnam War, and it looks like you'll be spending your summer looking for a guy named Charlie in the jungle. That's weird, I wonder where he is. This was a reality for many young Americans who found themselves looking at a piece of paper that either meant they could die in a jungle or be in trouble with the law. However, when option A and B suck, go for C. In this case, that was draft dodging. Americans who received the mandatory volunteer letter fled in decently large numbers to other countries so Uncle Sam couldn't have his way. Man, he ended up here in Canada. Number 3, Napalm Girl. I briefly touched on this in the last part, but Kim Fantee deserves a moment of her own. There's a picture that made it out of the Vietnam War known as Napalm Girl. Well, Kim is that girl. Again, we cannot show you the image due to its graphic nature, but it's basically screaming Vietnamese children running down the road after a napalm strike near their location. Unfortunately for Kim, she was an innocent victim of total war. Her clothes were burned off and her skin was severely damaged by napalm, leaving her with scars and reminders of a horrible past. Almost 50 years later, she's still around to tell the story, and how she used faith and forgiveness to forgive those that caused so much pain and destruction to her country and herself. The photograph of Kim is probably the most infamous image of the war, and maybe the 20th century, and is a part of the media coverage that helped inspire Americans to pull out of the war. Number 2. I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. Good old Tricky Dick had just become president, and he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam, but first, they had to invade Cambodia. Why Cambodia? Well, basically the Viet Cong had this genius idea of moving war goods, materials, and troops on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but also moving through Cambodia, which at the time was neutral. The US just wasn't looking there at first. However, when it was realized it would be a tactical good decision to stop that from happening, for poor Tricky Dick, the invasion of Cambodia felt like he was furthering the war rather than trying to bring it to a close. To make matters worse, the Pentagon Papers were leaked, and it was discovered that America had increased involvement and not decreased. The people had had enough, and anti-war movements sparked across the country. It wasn't too long after this that they pulled out of Vietnam. And Cambodia. Number 1. The music. A lot can be said about the Vietnam War, but if sitting through history classes and watching some old movies doesn't paint the picture, then sit down and have a listen to the music that was made during the conflict. A lot to do with counterculture at the time. Once the Vietnam War went into second gear, art began to have its take on the Far East conflict. Books, movies, plays, but nothing more reachable and mainstream as music. The Doors, Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, and the classic CCR. If your thoughts of Vietnam don't feature Fortunate Son by CCR, is it really a thought about Vietnam? I say no. This is kind of disturbing, as when you compare it to music one decade prior, it's completely different. Despite baby boomers causing havoc on minimum wage retail workers today, their music is pretty good and does a good job of depicting the emotions felt in such a grim situation. Yes, I love the music. I love the music of the American people. Number 10. Crying Wolf. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a conflict between Vietnam and US forces in 1964. What's messed up about that is that 2 days later, it happened again. Actually, it didn't. Big prank. The second incident was fabricated by the US just to justify ramping up their presence in Vietnam. Sadly, it worked, as the next 8 years in Vietnam would end up being a total snipe storm for the US, as they would encounter problems abroad and at home. Thank goodness this is the only time the American government would ever lie about anything ever again, right? This was officially declassified decades later. Number 9. Agent Orange. The world agreed not to use chemical warfare after the First World War, as it was extremely cruel and lethal. So, you might be surprised that America used chemical weapons during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange, brought to you by the Dow Chemical Company, was a herbicide and defoliant dropped and sprayed from air vehicles to cut down the thick jungle brush. Viet Cong soldiers were excellent at living off the land and concealing themselves in the jungle. Bad guy hides in jungle, you remove the jungle. Makes sense. The chemical was extremely effective, but what's so messed up was the negative health side effects. Soldiers that were exposed to the chemical developed cancers years after the war. But what's even more crazy is how it affected the Vietnamese people. It created children with really bad health defects, and to this day there are many people who live with ill side effects of Agent Orange. That's just not right, man. That's wrong. That is so wrong, dude. Number 8. French Indochina. The US was not the first superpower trying to tame Vietnam. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and it used to be a colony of France. And when they no longer wanted to be a part of that, France came down to give them a piece of their minds. But you can probably guess how that went, considering the US was there 20 years later trying to do the same thing. While France was trying to keep a colony and the US was trying to stop communism from spreading to other countries, Vietnam was trying to fight for its independence, which is ironic for America because that's how they became a country. And yes, I know that the communist movement in Vietnam wasn't great by any standards, but the regime America was trying to put in place was no better. As much as France would have liked to keep Vietnam, times were changing, and there was no victory in sight, with or without American support. Number 7. Well, that escalated quickly. Up until 1967, the war was bad. But it was nothing compared to what was going to happen in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a massive military campaign designed to destroy the foreign invaders. All across the country, key targets were being attacked, and it seemed overnight that the war went from a 6 all the way to an 11. What's so messed up though is even though the VC did not achieve major victories, it was costing a lot of American lives. With the Viet Cong using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the war not only escalated in Vietnam, but had reached neighboring nations like Cambodia. This had an effect on the war back home. The US thought and told people it would be a quick war. They had the advantage. But after the VC flexing their military might, it was clear that more US soldiers would be needed to win the war, which some people were beginning to question in the first place. And as time went on, most people would protest America's involvement. Number 6. A terrible loss of life. The Vietnam War is one of the most important events in US history, and honestly world history too. It was a very hot war during the Cold War, which we could do a whole video on that itself. A time of superpowers ready to annihilate one another at the push of a red button. Thousands of young men volunteered or were drafted to fight in a war that would humble the very powerful country. 58,141 Americans would lose their lives in order to contain communism. Of that 61%, they were under the age of 21. That is an insane, I can't even believe that. The Vietnamese lost over 300,000 people in the conflict. The war is remembered for being a tragic loss of life, and the domino theory that communism would spread throughout the world if containment was not initiated didn't happen, as most countries today just aren't communist.